Gayatri Spivak's critique of Foucault and Deleuze in Can the Subaltern Speak draws heavily from a single conversation between the two people, and the conversation's in an interview titled Intellectuals and Power, including Foucault's collection language counter memory practice. Now, it's worth kind of mentioning because it means the critique does not engage with the full breadth of either thinker's work, which was considerably more nuanced across the many books and their lectures. But this is, an objection, to Spivak, though it does not necessarily invalidate her core points. Now, what Foucault and Deleuze agree on, right, is that, they might be different, despite them, both Foucault and Deleuze share a framework that Spivak targets. Both argue that subjectivity, the way that we experience ourselves as persons with desires and beliefs and agency, is largely constructed by power. Institutions don't just punish people, they produce people. They shape who we think we are. So for Foucault, the army is a clear example, because military institutions impose repetitive drills and very rigid discipline. And that's not to just punish people, but it's to produce a particular kind of human body and a mind. It might be a little bit docile, it would be efficient, obedient. So the threat of punishment is less important than the internalization of order. The soldier eventually polices himself. Now for Deleuze and Gayatri, both works by, both this kind of idea of power works for them by reducing human multiplicity. So you have the rich, the chaotic complexity of the desires and the drives into neat, manageable identities. And their response is what they call schizoanalysis, a practice of identifying and affirming the way humans exceed or overflow any fixed category imposed on them. So both positions locate resistance within subjectivity itself, right, in speech and desire, and the very act of speaking against power. And Spivak's first critique is the problem of ideology, and she argues that both Foucault and Deleuze significantly underestimate the role of ideology. Her position draws on two thinkers. First is Louis Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher whose essay Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses argue that institutions like schools and churches and media don't just serve the state through force, they normalize capitalist relations of production, making exploitation feel natural and inevitable. And second, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who had a concept of hegemony, described how the ruling classes maintain power not through violence alone, but by making their worldview the common sense of the entire society. And Spivak's point is that when Foucault suggests prisoners can produce an anti-carceral discourse simply by speaking, simply by giving accounts of prison horror and problems, he's implying that speech alone can strike against power. But this ignores the fact that ideology conditions, what can even be thought or said, right? People can still speak against their conditions and still thoroughly be captured, by the assumptions of the system exploiting them. Exploitation continues regardless of what is said about it. So to locate the transgressive potential purely, in the act of speaking is to deny the depth at which ideology operates. Now, the second critique of Spivak is the transparent mediator. And this is probably the best one that she points out, which is both Foucault and Deleuze present themselves as neutral mediators. They're these intellectuals who step aside and simply allow the voices of the oppressed to be heard. And they claim to speak for no one, they're just kind of merely amplifying voices from below. Now this sounds quite cool, this is nice, if this is true, this is cool, it's admirable. But Spivak argues that it's a fiction, and it's a dangerous fiction, because Foucault and Deleuze were among the most elite intellectuals in France. The very act of deciding whose voice gets amplified or translated and presented to the broader public is itself an exercise of power. So when they engage with the colonized other, the people they actually access are invariably the most privileged within those settings. Those who speak the right language, operate within the recognizable intellectual frameworks, and fit within what the scholar Edward Said called Orientalism, the Western tendency to romanticize and exoticize non-Western peoples in a way that confirm Western assumptions rather than genuinely encountering a difference. And so their claim to transparency, to being neutral conduits, conceals their positional power rather than interrogating it. and so they replicate the very structure of speaking for others that they claim to dismantle. Now, why Spivak prefers Derrida? Right, well, Spivak turns to Jacques Derrida not because she thinks that he escapes privilege, right, he doesn't, but because his method of deconstruction at the least names and interrogates. Now, the problem with transparent privileged position, rather than assuming it innocently. Now, deconstruction shows that every claim to neutrality depends on the suppressed, the hypervisible, the other, that haunts and undermines it. And this doesn't solve the problem of speaking for others, but it refuses to pretend the problem doesn't exist, which is precisely what Spivak accuses Foucault and Deleuze of doing. Now, ultimately the biggest objection is that Foucault and Deleuze's theories of power and resistance were built primarily on the European examples, French prisons, for example, or European armies and Western psychiatric institutions. But when you apply these to frameworks to colonialism, which operates through the violent erasure of languages and culture and legal systems, entire modes of being, they break down. Colonialism does not merely shape subjectivity, it destroys the very conditions under which certain people can speak and be heard at all. A theory of resistance that depends on power of speech cannot account for the system that has structurally eliminated the possibility of certain speech being received. And so this is probably, the most powerful contribution that Spivak gives. That radical European theory, when it's, might be well-intentioned, can reproduce the colonial structures it claims to oppress. Or oppose, should I say, simply by failing to kind of notice, or falling into the trap of not noticing its own, limits. So the question really is, do you think the Subaltern can speak in a colonialist society? Spivak would say no. Deleuze and Foucault, they might, disagree, right? Or maybe they don't recognize that they're a problem in their work. But thank you guys for watching anyway, and peace.